There comes a moment in the journey of healing from a toxic relationship when the noise finally stops. The messages stop. The calls disappear. The emotional chaos that once filled your days suddenly fades into silence. You choose no contact, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of a deep realization that your peace matters more than the endless cycle of manipulation and confusion. And then something unexpected happens. The narcissist also becomes silent. At first, that silence can feel unsettling. Many people expect that once they cut contact, the narcissist will immediately chase, provoke, or attempt to pull them back in. But when the narcissist also withdraws, the mind begins to race with questions. Why are they quiet? Have they moved on? Are they planning something? Did the silence mean they never cared at all? This is the moment when the emotional battlefield shifts from the outside world into the inner world, because the truth is that no contact is not just a boundary. It is a psychological turning point. For so long, the narcissistic dynamic thrived on reaction. Your responses, your emotions, your attempts to explain yourself, your efforts to fix what was never yours to fix. What was never yours to fix. That interaction was the fuel that kept the toxic cycle alive. When you step into no contact, you remove that fuel. And when the narcissist goes silent too, something deeper begins to unfold. This silence is not emptiness. It is pressure. It is tension in a game where both sides are waiting, observing, recalibrating. Narcissistic personalities often rely on control, attention, and emotional supply. When those suddenly disappear, the narcissist is forced into a space they rarely tolerate well, a space where they are not the center of someone else's emotional world. Their silence is often strategic, sometimes confused, sometimes filled with ego-driven patience, as they wait for the moment they believe you will break first. But here is the part that many people do not initially realize. The real game at this stage is not about them anymore. It is about you. It is about whether you can remain steady in the quiet. It is about whether you can resist the powerful pull of curiosity, doubt, and emotional memory. Narcissistic relationships create deep psychological conditioning. Your brain becomes used to the chaos, the highs and lows, the constant checking, the desperate need for closure. Silence challenges that conditioning. In this phase, healing and temptation exist side by side. The silence gives you space to see the relationship more clearly, to recognize the patterns that once kept you trapped, and to begin rebuilding the parts of yourself that was slowly eroded by manipulation, gaslighting, and emotional exhaustion. Yet at the same time, the quiet can stir a longing for answers, for validation, for some form of acknowledgement that what you went through mattered. This is why the real game begins here. It is no longer about confrontation or arguments, or trying to prove your worth. It becomes a test of emotional independence, a test of whether you can sit in the discomfort of not knowing, while choosing self-respect over the familiar pull of the toxic cycle. And in that silence, something powerful begins to grow. Something the narcissist never expected. Clarity begins to replace confusion. Strength slowly replaces the old habit of chasing explanations. And the longer you remain grounded in your decision, the more the balance of power shifts in ways that are quiet, invisible, and deeply transformative. When you finally choose no contact with a narcissist, it often feels like you have stepped out of a storm. For so long, there was noise, arguments, emotional manipulation, confusion, endless attempts to explain yourself, defend yourself, or prove your worth. The relationship thrived on reaction. Every response you gave, every tear you shed, Every moment you tried to fix things became part of the emotional supply that kept the dynamic alive. Then one day, you decide that your peace matters more than the chaos, and you step away. You close the door. You stop responding. You reclaim your silence. What surprises many people is that sometimes the narcissist also becomes quiet. The calls stop, the messages disappear. The dramatic confrontations you once expected never arrive. And in that moment, the silence can feel deeply unsettling, almost like standing in the middle of a battlefield where both sides have suddenly stopped moving. This silence is not random. Narcissistic personalities are often very strategic when it comes to control and attention. When you first go no contact, they may expect you to return quickly. They have seen the pattern before, moments of distance followed by reconciliation, apologies or emotional conversations that pull you back into the cycle. In their mind, your silence is temporary. They believe that curiosity, guilt, loneliness, or emotional habit will eventually push you to reach out first. So they go quiet too. This becomes a psychological waiting game. Their silence is often fueled by ego and control. They do not want to appear as though they are chasing you. In their internal narrative, they are still the one with power, the one who expects you to come back. By remaining silent, they try to create pressure. They rely on the emotional conditioning that the relationship built inside you over time. And that conditioning can be powerful. When someone has spent months or years walking on emotional eggshells, trying to manage another person's reactions, the sudden absence of communication can create a strange discomfort. The mind begins to wander. You may wonder if they have moved on. You may question whether the relationship meant anything at all. You may even feel tempted to break the silence, just to release the tension. But this is where something incredibly important begins to happen in your life. The silence becomes a mirror. Without the constant distraction of the narcissist's voice, you begin to hear your own thoughts more clearly. You start noticing the exhaustion you once normalized. You begin recognizing how often your boundaries were ignored, how frequently your feelings were dismissed, and how much of yourself you slowly gave away trying to maintain a connection that was never truly balanced. In this stage, the silence becomes a form of protection. It creates space for your nervous system to calm down, for your mind to step out of the fog of manipulation, and for your sense of identity to slowly return. What once felt like emptiness begins to reveal itself as freedom. The absence of chaos becomes the first sign that you are no longer trapped inside the emotional storm. Meanwhile, the narcissist often remains in their own version of the silence battle. They may watch from a distance, waiting for signs that you will break. They may assume that time will weaken your resolve, but the longer you remain grounded in your decision, the more the dynamic shifts. Because the power that once belonged to the person creating the noise slowly moves toward the person who has learned to live peaceful without it. And in that quiet space, you begin discovering that the greatest victory was never about winning against them, but about finally choosing yourself in a way that no longer requires their presence. To feel whole when you step into silence after deciding to go no contact. It may feel at first like you have lost something. You were once part of constant communication. Even if that communication was painful, confusing, or exhausting, there were messages, reactions, emotional highs and lows, and a sense that the relationship was always moving in some direction. When you remove yourself from that cycle, life suddenly becomes quiet, and many people initially interpret that quiet as weakness, absence, or even defeat. But something much deeper is happening beneath that silence. A shift in power begins to unfold, and it is a shift the narcissist rarely expects. Narcissistic dynamics are built on a very specific structure. Control is maintained through reaction. When they provoke you and you respond, they gain information about your emotions. When they criticize you and you defend yourself, they pull you deeper into the conversation. When they withdraw affection and you chase clarity, they confirm their influence over your emotional world. Every reaction becomes a signal that they still occupy space in your mind and your heart. Your silence interrupts that system completely. When you stop explaining, stop arguing, stop trying to make them understand, you remove the emotional feedback they relied on. At first, they may assume it is temporary. They may believe that your silence is simply a phase, a moment of frustration that will pass once the emotional tension becomes too strong for you to handle. But as time moves forward and you remain quiet, something begins to unsettle them. The familiar script they relied on is no longer working. They cannot measure your feelings. They cannot predict your next move. The person who once reacted to every push and pull has stepped out of the pattern. And for someone who thrives on control, unpredictability is deeply uncomfortable. Your silence creates a space they cannot easily manipulate. There are no emotional openings for them to twist. There are no explanations they can turn against you. There are no arguments they can redirect to make themselves the victim or the authority. The entire structure of control begins to weaken simply because you are no longer participating in it. At the same time, something powerful is happening within you. The longer you remain in that silence, the more distance your mind gains from the confusion that once surrounded you. Patterns that were once difficult to see begin to appear with clarity. You start recognizing how often your emotions were managed, how frequently your boundaries were dismissed, and how much of your energy was spent trying to stabilize a relationship built on imbalance. Silence becomes more than distance. It becomes a form of self-respect. The narcissist may sense this shift, even without direct communication. They may begin to feel the absence of attention that once fed their sense of importance. They may wonder whether you are truly moving forward, building a life that no longer revolves around them. That possibility alone can challenge the narrative they once believed, the belief that you would always remain within their orbit. But the most meaningful transformation is not their discomfort. It is your growth, because the longer you remain grounded in your silence, the more you begin to reconnect with your own emotional stability. You start realizing that peace does not come from winning arguments or forcing someone to understand you. It comes from stepping away from dynamics that require you or constantly defend your reality. And in that quiet space where you once felt uncertain, you begin to feel something unfamiliar yet deeply empowering. The steady realization that the power you thought they held over your life was slowly dissolving the moment you stopped giving it to them. When both you and the narcissist stop reaching out, a very unusual dynamic begins to unfold. For a long time, the relationship may have felt like a constant emotional tug of war. There were messages, reactions, confrontations, moments of distance, followed by sudden attempts to reconnect. The cycle was exhausting, but familiar. Even the conflict kept the connection alive. But when both sides fall into silence, the familiar rhythm disappears. And what remains is a psychological space where something much deeper begins to happen. This moment often feels confusing at first. Many people expect that once they go no contact, the narcissist will immediately try to break the silence. Movies and stories often portray dramatic attempts to win someone back, emotional confessions, or relentless efforts to regain attention. But narcissistic dynamics rarely follow that script. Instead, what can emerge is a quiet standoff when neither person makes the first move. It can begin to feel like a psychological chess game. Narcissistic personalities are highly invested in control and image. Reaching out first may feel, in their mind, like losing power. Their ego often tells them that you should be the one who returns, the one who apologizes, the one who proves that you still need them. So they wait. They observe from a distance, sometimes checking indirectly through social media or mutual connections, but maintaining the appearance of silence. At the same time, you may find yourself sitting with a very different emotional experience. The absence of communication can stir up questions that were once buried beneath the noise of the relationship. You may wonder what they are thinking. You may question whether they ever cared. You may even feel a strange pull to reach out, not because the relationship was healthy, but because the human mind naturally seeks closure. This is where the psychological chess game becomes most powerful. The real move is not about who sends the next message. The real move is about emotional discipline. Every day you choose not to reach out, you are quietly breaking a pattern that may have existed for months or even years. Narcissistic relationships often train people to respond quickly to emotional tension. Silence once meant danger. Distance once triggered anxiety. But in this new space, you begin to learn something different. You learn that discomfort does not require immediate action. You learn that unanswered questions do not need to control your behavior. And as time moves forward, the board of this psychological game begins to change. Without the constant emotional interaction, your mind slowly clears. You start to see the relationship from a wider perspective. The patterns that once kept you trapped begin to reveal themselves with surprising clarity. You may recognize how often your feelings were minimized, how frequently you were pulled into arguments that never truly resolved anything, how much of your energy was spent trying to understand someone who rarely tried to understand you. Meanwhile, the narcissist is left without the emotional reactions that once reinforced their sense of influence. Whether they admit it or not, the silence removes the audience they once relied on. The familiar push and pull that kept the dynamic alive no longer exists in the same way. What once felt like a tense waiting game slowly transforms into something else, into something else, into something else. The longer you remain steady in your silence, the more the focus shifts away from the moment and back toward your own life. Your attention moves toward healing, toward rebuilding your sense of stability, toward rediscovering the parts of yourself that were overshadowed by the emotional intensity of the relationship. And in that quiet transformation, you begin to realize that the true victory in this psychological chess game was never about making the final move against them, but about stepping away from the board altogether, while reclaiming the peace that was always waiting outside the game. As this journey unfolds, you begin to understand something that once felt impossible to believe. The silence that once scared you becomes the very space where your strength grows. What once felt like abandonment or uncertainty slowly transforms into clarity. You start realizing that peace does not come from getting the last word, winning the argument, or finally making the narcissist understand what they did to you. Peace comes from no longer needing their acknowledgement to validate your experience. The silence teaches you emotional independence. It shows you that your value was never defined by their attention, their approval, or their ability to return your love. The longer you remain committed to your boundaries, the more your confidence begins to rebuild. Your mind becomes calmer, your heart becomes lighter, and the emotional chaos that once dominated your life slowly fades into the background. And this is where the true transformation happens. What once felt like a battle slowly becomes a release. You stop measuring your healing based on what the narcissist does or does not do. Instead, your focus shifts toward building a life where your energy, your peace, and your self-respect are no longer negotiable. Because in the end, the real victory was never their silence or yours. The real victory was discovering that you no longer need the game at all.